The sirens cut through the evening like a knife through silk, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. I was standing on the wraparound porch of my newly acquired 1,000-acre ranch, a mug of coffee cooling in my hand, watching the sun bleed orange into the hills. The land stretched farther than the eye could see, rolling fields and old oak groves stitched together by miles of fence I hadn't finished repairing yet. It was quiet out here, too quiet for sirens. At first, I thought they were passing by on the county road. Then the lights crested my long gravel driveway, red and blue flashing against the dust like a bad omen. I laughed once, short and incredulous. "You've got to be kidding me." 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled in and stopped beside my barn, engines idling like impatient beasts. Doors opened. Boots hit gravel. Hands hovered near belts. One of the deputies looked around as if he'd stepped onto a movie set instead of private property. I knew exactly why they were here. The Homeowners Association. 3 days earlier, I'd moved in. 2 days earlier, I'd received a welcome packet the thickness of a phone book, delivered by a woman with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Yesterday, I'd torn down a rotting wooden sign at the edge of my property that read, "Cedar Valley Estates, rules make good neighbors." Apparently, that sign was protected community property. Apparently, tearing it down was a hostile act. And apparently, instead of knocking on my door like adults, the HOA had decided to call the cops. As the deputies walked toward me, I set my coffee down and straightened my jacket. I could already imagine the report. Uncooperative landowner. Possible disturbance. Non-compliance with HOA regulations. What they didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Valley Estates knew yet, was that while they were busy flexing their petty authority, they had just declared war on the wrong man. Because by the end of the week, I wouldn't just be another homeowner they could bully. I'd be their boss. The taller deputy stopped a few feet from the porch and tipped his hat politely. "Evening, sir. We received a call about property damage and a possible dispute. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" "Be my guest," I said, gesturing to the rocking chairs like this was a social call. "I assume this is about the sign." The shorter deputy raised an eyebrow. "You know why we're here." "I live in an HOA," I replied dryly. "Of course I know." They exchanged a glance, the kind cops share when they realize this won't be a simple in and out. The tall one cleared his throat. "The caller claims you destroyed association property without authorization." I nodded. That sign was leaning into my fence, rotted at the base, and one good windstorm away from crushing a cow. Or a kid. I removed it. "Did you notify the HOA first?" the shorter deputy asked. I smiled. Not friendly. Not hostile. Just amused. They notified me first. With threats and fines, and a demand that I repaint my barn-approved oath tones. The deputies looked past me then, really looked, at the massive barn, the acres upon acres of land, the fencing disappearing into the distance. "This is all yours?" the tall deputy asked. "All mine," I said. "Every last acre." He whistled softly. "That's a lot of HOA. Funny you should say that." I stepped inside and returned with a folder, thick, neat, and official-looking. I handed it over. The tall deputy flipped it open, his expression shifting from professional boredom to confusion, then to something like surprise. "Sir," he said slowly, "this says you're listed as a majority landholder of Cedar Valley Estates." "Correct. And that as of last quarter, you control," he paused, did the math again, "over 51% of the total land value." "Also correct." The shorter deputy leaned in. "Doesn't that mean that I have controlling interest?" I finished. "Yes, it does." They both looked at me now like I'd just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. "What exactly are you saying?" the tall one asked. I leaned against the porch rail, the last of the sun dipping behind the hills. "I'm saying the HOA called the cops on someone they should have been introducing themselves to properly." Silence settled in, heavy and delicious. "So," I continued, "unless I'm under arrest for improving my own property, I suggest you let whoever made that call know they might want to check the bylaws again." The deputies didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They didn't even look annoyed. They looked relieved. "We'll pass that along," the tall deputy said, handing back the folder. "Have a good evening." So, as they walked back to their cruisers, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I answered it, already knowing who it was. "This is Margaret from the HOA," a tight voice snapped. "We need to discuss your behavior." I watched the cruisers pull away, dust rising behind them like smoke after a retreat. "Oh, Margaret," I said pleasantly. "We really do." And with that, I smiled, because Section 1 of this little neighborhood drama was officially over. And the real story was just beginning. The next morning, the sun rose like a warning over Cedar Valley Estates. My coffee was hot, my porch was quiet, and the sense of anticipation in the air was thick enough to taste. I had spent the night reviewing the HOA bylaws, amendments, and every ridiculous rule they had ever sent me. Every clause that had once made my blood boil now made me smile. Because the more I read, the more I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. This HOA had been running on autopilot, and I had just flipped the switch. Margaret, of course, didn't know that yet. Her first email arrived at 8:07 a.m., all caps and italics and punctuation marks, as if she were waving a white flag of frustration in Morse code. "We need to meet immediately. This behavior is unacceptable." I replied with a simple, neutral, "Of course. Shall we meet at the clubhouse at noon?" By 11:30 a.m., I was pulling into the small parking lot of the Cedar Valley Clubhouse, my truck kicking up gravel like a warning shot. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and regret. Several board members were already there, shifting papers, murmuring to each other. They froze the moment I stepped in. "Good morning," I said, giving a slow, deliberate smile. "I believe we have a few things to discuss." Margaret, in a navy blazer that made her look like she had been waiting for a battle rather than a meeting, straightened immediately. "Sir," she said, tone tight, "we need to address the sign incident," I finished for her, leaning against the conference table. "Yes, I already know why you called the sheriff." She blinked, and I tapped the stack of folders I had brought. "And as it happens, this property and the majority of Cedar Valley Estates belongs to me. So technically, the HOA just called the cops on me, your new president." The room went from stiff to silent. One board member coughed, then quickly wished he hadn't. Margaret's voice wobbled, just slightly. That can't be. The bylaws." "The bylaws," I interrupted gently, "were amended last quarter. I own 51% of the land, which give me controlling interest. That makes me the HOA president by default. Congratulations, everyone. I hope you like me." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Some board members' hands went to their heads. Others stared at me as if I were the ghost of every HOA horror story they had ever heard. Margaret's color drained. She looked like someone who had just realized that their meticulous little world was about to implode. But, procedures," she said. "Meetings, votes, notice periods." I shook my head, all of which have been documented. And by the way, my first official act as HOA president is going to be clarifying what actually counts as association property, starting with your sign. I stood, walked to the window, and looked over the rolling hills that stretched beyond the clubhouse. "You see, the thing about owning 1,000 acres," I said, turning back to face them, "is that you can't enforce rules against yourself. It's a little awkward, isn't it?" Margaret's hands tightened into fists on the table. This isn't how things are supposed to happen. You can't just." "I just did," I said, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "But don't worry. I'm not here to be petty. I'm here to make things sensible." I could see them visibly relaxing, just slightly, and I decided to press my advantage. For starters, no more unnecessary fines, no more arbitrary rules about paint colors or garden gnomes, and definitely no calling the police on residents without first checking whether the property in question is actually part of the association or private land. Margaret's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. "And second," I continued, leaning forward on the table, "I would like to schedule a proper orientation for everyone. I want all HOA members to understand the real rules, real boundaries, and, most importantly, the real consequences of overstepping them." I could see their minds spinning, like old computer fans worrying under too much stress. They were imagining years of petty power suddenly evaporating in the heat of one meeting. Margaret finally recovered her voice. And what if the members object? I smiled, sweet and cold. By law, the members vote according to property ownership. Since I hold a majority, I could make any decision I wanted today, and it would pass. But I'm not that kind of president. I'm here to guide, not to dictate, though I won't hesitate if someone tries to undermine the rules. Or me. A younger board member, clearly one who had been quietly counting votes in his head, raised a hand. So, you mean we've been enforcing rules illegally? Yes, I said simply, and probably expensively. One by one, heads nodded. Murmurs filled the room, part disbelief, part relief, part fear. It was a strange cocktail, but I had to admit it was satisfying. Margaret's next words were sharper this time. And the sheriff, calling them like that, it's humiliating. I shrugged. You did call them. On me. I don't blame them. If anything, I'd say it's proof that the system works, just not in the way you expected. She glared. You're not taking this seriously. I leaned back, clasped my hand behind my head. I am taking it seriously. Seriously enough to make sure it never happens again. Silence fell. Then, slowly, Margaret exhaled. It was the sound of someone realizing they were on the wrong side of history. Or at least, on the wrong side of me. The rest of the meeting passed in a haze of paperwork, signatures, and begrudging nods. I outlined the new rules, reassigned committees, and restructured fines. By the end, Margaret looked like she had run a marathon through a swamp in heels. As I left the clubhouse, the sun blazing over the hills, I felt the thrill of victory, but also the quiet awareness that this was only the beginning. Being HOA president of Cedar Valley Estates wasn't about writing rules or enjoying power. It was about navigating the petty, vindictive, and utterly ridiculous world of neighbors who had been convinced they were untouchable. And now, they weren't. Back at the ranch, I stepped onto the porch, the horizon stretching endlessly before me. The land was mine. Yes, but so were the battles, the squabbles, the endless emails, complaints, and, inevitably, lawsuits. I sipped my coffee and smiled. This was going to be fun. By the time I returned to my ranch, the sun was dipping behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the fields. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and wild sage, a rare luxury I was learning to savor between HOA headaches. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in the quiet of my land, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Cedar Valley Estates board members weren't going to accept my restructuring quietly. Margaret, in particular, had the kind of tenacity that bordered on obsession. Within 24 hours, emails, text messages, and even carrier pigeons, or at least it felt like it, began pouring in. Complaints about leadership style, unfair practices, and unauthorized decisions flew across my inbox like angry swarms of bees. One even accused me of trampling HOA democracy and threatened to call a lawyer who specialized in minor inconveniences. I leaned back in my rocking chair on the porch, scrolling through the messages with a slow, deliberate amusement. I had anticipated resistance, of course, but resistance underestimating the new president? That was cute. Margaret sent a particularly venomous email, demanding an emergency board meeting for the following evening. The subject line read, "We must discuss your tyranny." I saved it to my amusement folder. When evening came, I drove up to the clubhouse again, the headlights cutting through the fading light. Inside, the room was buzzing, though not with confidence this time. It was anxiety, pure and palpable. Board members whispered behind papers, shot nervous glances at the door, and fidgeted as though the very walls might collapse on them if I walked in. I entered slowly, letting the door click behind me. "Evening, everyone," I said, voice calm, almost conversational. "I see the excitement has been brewing." Margaret stood, arms crossed, a hurricane of fury bottled neatly in a blazer. "We demand a vote to remove you as president. Your control is illegal. This is a coup." I raised an eyebrow. "A coup? Interesting choice of words. Shall we look at the bylaws together? You know, the ones that outline the president's election based on land ownership." She glared, but no one moved to challenge me. I could almost hear their internal calculations, weighing whether rebellion was worth a potential legal nightmare. The bylaws clearly state, I continued, opening my folder, that the majority landholder assumes the presidency. That happens to be me. 51% of Cedar Valley estates is mine. That makes me effectively untouchable in a vote. I let the words linger like smoke. Any attempt to remove me without legal grounds is not just futile, it's a violation of association law. Which would be ironic, don't you think, considering how worried you all were about law enforcement yesterday? Margaret's jaw tightened, but her voice betrayed her desperation. There must be loopholes. Some technicality. Anything to. I leaned forward, fingertips on the table. Loopholes are charming. They are also dangerous. Let me make something perfectly clear. I am not here to crush anyone. I am here to enforce sanity. And by sanity, I mean fairness, clarity, and boundaries. But if someone tries to undermine that, I will protect what is mine, both legally and personally. The murmur of unease grew. I could see the gears turning in their heads. The board members realized they were up against someone who knew exactly how to play the rules, and, more importantly, how to rewrite the ones that didn't make sense. Then, like a scene from a poorly scripted drama, one of the older board members, Mr. Hensley, spoke up. Maybe we should just adjust to the new leadership, perhaps cooperate rather than resist. I smiled. Wisdom from experience. Yes, Mr. Hensley, that's a much better approach than futile rebellion. I'll make you a deal, cooperate, and we all move forward. Resist, and, well, you've already seen the first example. I tapped the stack of folders again, each filled with bylaws, land deeds, and HOA documentation. I come prepared. Margaret's face reddened, and I could see the fire in her eyes fading to smoke. She tried one last desperate measure. We could call a lawyer. Surely they'll. I cut her off smoothly. Call them if you like. Just know that I've already consulted with my own legal team. And by the way, the likelihood of any lawyer advising against a controlling landholder is minimal. A heavy silence fell. Board members glanced at each other nervously. It was a kind of silence that carries the weight of realization, the moment when you understand that your carefully laid plan of resistance might just collapse without a fight. I leaned back, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Now, I am not unreasonable, I said, smiling faintly. I know change can be uncomfortable, but I promise it's the better. Rules that make sense. No arbitrary fines. No harassment. A functioning HOA that doesn't terrorize its own residents. That's my vision, and it starts with cooperation. The younger board member, Tim, shifted nervously in his chair. And if we agree, then we proceed, I said. We review the rules, update the policies, and restore Cedar Valley Estates to a community that people are proud to be part of. That's it. Margaret's shoulders slumped slightly. I could almost see the fight drain from her, replaced by reluctant acceptance. And the sign. I leaned against the table, smirking. It stays where it belongs. On your property, if you care to maintain it. Otherwise, consider it free real estate maintenance courtesy of the president. The room was quiet again, but this time it was different. Not fear, not confusion, just resignation and a strange kind of relief. They understood that the rebellion had failed before it even began. As I left the clubhouse that evening, the sky painted in streaks of violet and gold, I realized something important. Being HOA president wasn't about exerting power. It was about navigating chaos, understanding psychology, and knowing exactly when to push and when to let go. Back at the ranch, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and walked out to the edge of my property. The fields were empty, save for the occasional deer grazing in the distance. I thought about the board members, Margaret's steely glare, and the countless complaints that would inevitably continue to trickle in. And I smiled, because now they weren't just neighbors. They were lessons in patience, strategy, and, if nothing else, amusement. I raised my glass to the horizon. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring another challenge. Maybe a prank from a disgruntled member. Maybe an attempt to undermine me quietly. Maybe, If I was lucky, a confrontation I could turn into a masterclass of authority. Whatever it was, Cedar Valley Estates was mine. Every acre, every rule, every petty complaint. And I was ready for all of it. After all, if the HOA thought they could intimidate me, they had another thing coming. And this time, there will be no sirens. Only strategy and a slow, inevitable victory that would leave them questioning every single assumption they had about power and me. For the first few days after the failed rebellion, Cedar Valley Estates was eerily quiet. Board members avoided my gaze. Emails slowed to polite inquiries rather than threats, and Margaret seemed to have vanished entirely. It almost felt like I had won. Almost. I quickly learned, however, that an HOA's wrath is rarely so easily contained. Just because the board had submitted to the law didn't mean they were willing to accept it quietly. While I was busy enjoying the vast expanse of my ranch, they were busy hatching plans, small, secretive, and petty, but effective if executed correctly. It started with the little things. A missing mailbox that appeared suspiciously near my driveway entrance. An emergency meeting scheduled at midnight. Anonymous letters slid under my door, complaining about noise, livestock, and the precise shade of paint on my barn, even though it had never been painted since I moved in. I smiled each time I discovered one of these attempts. They were clever, in the way a raccoon is clever when it thinks it's stealing your trash. The tipping point came one Thursday morning when I received a text message from Margaret's number, though I doubted she sent it herself. It read, "We're going to make you pay. This is your last warning." I laughed, loud and unrestrained, spilling my coffee in the process. "Oh, Margaret," I muttered, "you really have no idea." I decided to let them believe they had the upper hand. It's always more satisfying to watch someone attempt to dig a hole and not realize that you're holding the shovel. That evening, I received an invitation to what the board termed a strategy session. It was carefully worded, designed to make me think it was an olive branch, a chance to negotiate. I knew better. They were plotting. The meeting took place in the smallest conference room in the clubhouse, the one that smelled faintly of mildew and desperation. 7 board members were already seated, faces tight with forced civility. Margaret arrived last. The picture contained fury, clipboard in hand as though she could legislate her own anger into law. I stepped inside casually, letting the door click shut behind me. "Evening, everyone," I said, smiling. "I see we're having a private discussion." Margaret's jaw tightened. "This is a confidential meeting of the HOA board," she said sharply. "We need to discuss measures to address your leadership style and recent actions." I walked slowly to the head of the table, tapping the edge with my fingers. "Actions? You mean removing a dangerous, rotting sign? Or perhaps restructuring a board that had lost sight of its own bylaws?" She flinched slightly, but composed herself immediately. "You've overstepped. You've undermined the authority of the board. The residents are unhappy." I let my eyes drift to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking my land. Funny, I haven't seen a single unhappy resident. Just worried board members who think they can hide behind procedural technicalities. They whispered among themselves, eyes darting back and forth. The tension was delicious. Margaret spoke again. We've decided to take measures to reclaim control. If necessary, legal action. If necessary, alliances with other members. I raised an eyebrow. Measures? Alliances? Tell me, is this about governance or just another HOA tantrum? They hesitated. That hesitation was my window. I leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. "Look," I said softly, almost conspiratorially, "if you have concerns about my leadership, there's an easy solution. Follow the rules. Respect property lines. Follow procedure. Anything else, and you're wasting your energy. Because I own the land, I control the votes, and I can enforce the rules much more efficiently than you can sabotage them." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And if we push back anyway?" I smiled thinly. "Then you'll learn why it's important to read the bylaws carefully, and why it's dangerous to assume the president is just another neighbor you can intimidate." The meeting ended in stunned silence. As I walked out, I could feel them seating behind me, plotting, desperate to regain some sense of control. Back at the ranch, I poured myself a drink and sat on the porch, surveying my kingdom. The night was alive with the sounds of crickets, the faint rustle of trees, and the occasional distant bark of a coyote. It was a peaceful symphony, contrasting sharply with the storm I knew was brewing in the clubhouse. Over the next week, the plots became bolder. I discovered a board member attempting to file an official complaint about improper land management, citing everything from illegal fencing to unauthorized landscaping. Another member tried to organize a petition demanding that I step down. They didn't realize that all signatures on that petition were meaningless if the majority landholder was opposed. Margaret, undeterred, began circulating secret emails, encouraging minor sabotage, planting signs in wrong places, spreading rumors about unauthorized activities, and attempting to convince a few of the smaller property owners that I was overreaching my authority. Each attempt gave me insight into their methods, their weaknesses, and their predictable panic under pressure. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was learning the art of HOA psychology. Every small rebellion became a lesson, every petty threat an opportunity. One night, I set up motion-activated cameras around the property, primarily as a precaution. What I captured amused me more than it alarmed me. Around midnight, a small group of board members, flashlights in hand, crept near my barn. Their whispered voices carried faintly through the night. "We'll show him. Just wait until he sees this." I smiled, muted laughter threatening to escape. This was going to be fun. The next morning, I printed the footage and sent it to Margaret, along with a short, polite note. "It's hard to enforce rules if you're constantly trying to break them. Consider this a friendly reminder. I know what's happening on my property." Emails exploded. Calls came in. Margaret tried to explain, deny, and intimidate simultaneously. But it was too late. The board realized they had been caught in the act. From that point on, the rebellion faltered. Secret alliances dissolved. Whispers of mutiny vanished, and the HOA members began approaching me instead of plotting against me. It was subtle at first, tentative questions about bylaws, cautious suggestions for improvements. But it was a start. By the end of the week, the clubhouse was filled with a strange energy. Respect, fear, and grudging admiration mixed together in a volatile cocktail. I had won not through confrontation, but through understanding, observation, and strategy. I hadn't just defended my position. I had reshaped the entire power dynamic of Cedar Valley Estates. As I returned home, the stars beginning to pierce the velvet sky, I looked over my land and realized the truth. Being the HOA president of 1,000 acres wasn't about bureaucracy or petty rules. It was about patience, foresight, and knowing exactly how far to push before your opponents broke themselves. Margaret and the board would learn that lesson eventually, and I would be waiting. Because in the quiet of my ranch, surrounded by my land, my bonds, and my horses, I understood one simple rule. In a game of power, predictability is your enemy, patience is your weapon, and knowing when to strike is everything. And strike, I would. For a week, Cedar Valley Estates had been eerily calm. Board members tiptoed around me, sending hesitant emails and making awkward small talk whenever we passed each other at the clubhouse. It was almost suspicious how well-behaved they had become. Almost. I knew better. The quiet was a prelude to a storm I had been expecting, and one I was more than prepared to weather. It started subtly. A misplaced gate latch here, a mysterious pile of debris there. Then came the more aggressive attempts. Unauthorized flyers stapled to community bulletin boards, complaints filed under fake names, and one particularly audacious attempt to plant evidence that my horses had wandered onto someone else's property. By midweek, it was clear the board wasn't just resisting, they were escalating. And Margaret? She was orchestrating it all with the precision of a general planning a final assault. I decided it was time for a proactive approach. If they wanted to play war, I would give them a battlefield of my own making. I spent the next 2 days meticulously planning a counter-strategy, turning their own schemes against them with a precision that would make any chess master proud. The first step was intelligence. I had cameras on every corner of my property, motion detectors at the barn, and a network of friendly neighbors who reported anything unusual. By Thursday afternoon, I had a detailed map of every likely route the board might use for sabotage. Every member's habits, schedules, and even preferred coffee shops were logged in my notebook. Thursday evening, I called a special HOA meeting. Naturally, the board assumed it was a trap, and they were correct, But that didn't mean they were ready for the full picture. The meeting was held at the clubhouse, but I arrived with a plan. As I entered, I noticed the subtle shifts. Margaret's hand clutching her clipboard a little too tightly, Mr. Hensey fidgeting nervously, Tim glancing repeatedly at the clock as if hoping to escape before trouble began. "Good evening, everyone," I said, voice calm, measured, and slightly dangerous. "I called this meeting to discuss the state of Cedar Valley Estates. It seems we've had several incidents lately that warrant clarification." Margaret leaned forward, jaw tight. "We've had incidents because your leadership has been aggressive, unilateral, disruptive." I smiled. Aggressive? Unilateral? Disruptive? I prefer decisive, lawful, and effective. But let's focus on the incidents, shall we? I gestured toward a large screen I had set up, and with a click, images and footage appeared. Board members attempting to tamper with my gate, sneaking into my property at odd hours, and even trying to remove a small fence section. The videos were grainy enough to be anonymous at first glance, but detailed enough to make their identities unmistakable. The room went silent. Eyes widened, jaws dropped. Margaret's face went from anger to panic in seconds. I don't, she stammered. "You don't what?" I asked gently. "You don't understand that every move you make is visible? That attempting sabotage against your president is, well, counterproductive?" I let the pause stretch, letting the tension build. "Let me be perfectly clear. Any further attempt at harassment, sabotage, or illegal activity will be met with immediate legal action. You've already crossed lines that should never have been crossed, and the evidence is indisputable." Margaret's hands tightened into fists on the table. We were trying to protect the community." I leaned back, letting my words cut slowly. Protect the community from what? Law-abiding property management? From fair rules? Or from the realization that control is not quite what you thought it was? The silence that followed was deafening. Board members avoided eye contact, whispering quietly, realizing for the first time that the threat they had imagined, me, was not a man to intimidate, but a man who anticipated every move they made. Then came the final blow. I opened a separate folder, detailed, line-by-line analysis of the HOA bylaws, showing exactly how each attempted action they had taken violated policy. Not suggestions, not interpretations. Facts. Concrete, indisputable facts. Margaret's face paled as I outlined each misstep, each potential legal liability, and the consequences they could face if they continued their secret plots. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," I said softly, walking around the table. "I'm here to ensure that Cedar Valley Estates functions properly, efficiently, and lawfully. But make no mistake, if you continue your schemes, you will face repercussions that go far beyond mere embarrassment." I paused at Margaret's side, letting the words sink in. "So here's the choice. Cooperate, respect boundaries, and rebuild trust, or continue plotting in secret and face the full consequences of your actions. The decision is yours." Her shoulders slumped. Defeat was written across her face, though she tried to hide it with a tight-lipped smile. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, silently acknowledging what I already knew. They had lost. Completely. Over the next hour, we worked through a new, comprehensive code of conduct. No more secret plots, no more unauthorized actions, and clear guidelines for reporting concerns. I even allowed a few minor concessions, a token compromise to let them save face. By the time the meeting ended, Margaret and the board members looked like shadows of their former selves. Fear, respect, and grudging admiration lingered in the air. They had learned, finally, that challenging the president of Cedar Valley Estates was a losing game. Back at the ranch, I poured a glass of bourbon, feeling the satisfaction of victory settle in. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the land in a golden glow. I stood on the porch, surveying my domain, every acre peaceful under quiet evening sky. For the first time since I arrived, I felt the balance restored. The HOA had tried to undermine me. They had plotted, schemed, and schemed again. And yet, here I was, not just surviving, but thriving. Cedar Valley Estates was finally secure, lawful, orderly, and under my control. Of course, I knew it wouldn't always be this simple. Margaret and the board might still try minor annoyances, neighborly disputes might flare, and there would always be unexpected challenges on a 1,000-acre ranch. But I had learned a vital lesson. Anticipation, strategy, and knowledge of the rules were far more powerful than fear, intimidation, or small-scale rebellion. And as the stars began to blanket the night sky, I realized something else. The game wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase, one where I set the rules, dictated the pace, and ensured that Cedar Valley Estates would run on my terms. Tomorrow might bring chaos, complaints, or even a new plot, but I would meet it head-on, as I always had, prepared, calm, and entirely in control. Because on this ranch, with this land, and with this authority, I was untouchable, and I intended to keep it that way. The week after the HOA's final gambit felt almost surreal. Cedar Valley Estates was quiet. The board members moved through their duties with mechanical efficiency, careful to follow every rule I had reinforced. Margaret, once a tempest of frustration and fury, now greeted me with cautious civility, her email polite and strangely subdued. For the first time, I felt a rare sense of peace on my ranch. I walked across the property one morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist curl around the fence posts. The horses grazed lazily in the pasture, a few cows meandered toward the barn, and the only sound was a gentle creak of an old oak tree swaying in the breeze. For once, there was no HOA meeting looming, no whispers of rebellion, no anonymous complaints sliding under my door. I let myself smile. Of course, I knew better than to assume it would last forever. Cedar Valley Estates had a history of chaos built into its DNA, and neighbors, well-meaning or otherwise, were prone to petty grievances. But for now, I could enjoy the fruits of strategy, patience, and sheer persistence. The first sign of true progress came when a small group of residents approached me at the edge of my property, looking tentative but hopeful. They wanted guidance on landscaping, fence placement, and even suggestions for organizing community events. I realized, with a quiet satisfaction, that my authority was now respected. Not feared, though a little fear never hurt, but respected. Margaret eventually requested a private meeting with me, citing a desire to rebuild trust and cooperation. I agreed, curious to see if she had truly learned her lesson, or if this was another subtle ploy. We met in the same clubhouse that had witnessed many attempts at rebellion. Margaret was dressed in business casual rather than battle-ready blazers. Her tone, while cautious, was surprisingly honest. "I underestimated you," she admitted. "I thought I could manipulate the system, intimidate you, and maintain control. I was wrong." I leaned back, arms crossed, smiling faintly. "It's an easy mistake to make," I said. "But Cedar Valley Estates isn't run on intimidation. It's run on clear rules, foresight, and understanding the chain of authority. Once you realize that, cooperation becomes a lot more productive." Her expression softened. I wanted what was best for the community. I guess I forgot that sometimes the person best equipped to lead isn't the loudest or the most forceful. It's the one who understands the rules and owns the land. I chuckled softly. Exactly. And ownership isn't just about land. It's about responsibility. That includes keeping the peace, ensuring fairness, and occasionally teaching lessons through carefully monitored evidence. Margaret's smile was faint, but genuine. "I think we can work together now. If you guide us, the rest of the board will follow." I nodded. "Good. Let's make Cedar Valley Estates a place where rules exist for everyone's benefit, not just a way to assert power." Over the next few weeks, I began implementing changes that reflected both fairness and practicality. The board adjusted community regulations, removing outdated rules and replacing them with clear, enforceable policies. Fines were rationalized. Complaint procedures became structured and transparent. Even the paint restrictions on barns and homes were replaced with reasonable guidelines. Residents started to notice. Emails of gratitude replaced complaints. Neighborhood gossip shifted from petty squabbles to admiration for the new HOA leadership. Margaret, once my fiercest opponent, became my most reliable ally, assisting in the implementation of reforms and keeping the board in line. Of course, life on a 1,000-acre ranch isn't without surprises. One evening, I found a raccoon attempting to steal carrots from the garden. Another day, a neighbor's dog wandered across the pasture, prompting a quick but polite conversation about fencing etiquette. Even with absolute control over the HOA, small inconveniences continued to remind me that perfection is rare and humorously elusive. One particularly memorable incident involved a new resident who attempted to introduce a herd of exotic goats to their property without consulting the board. Within an hour, I had a polite but firm letter outlining containment regulations, coupled with an offer to provide advice on goat-proof fencing. The resident complied with good humor, clearly impressed by both my preparedness and the clarity of the rules. Even Margaret occasionally sent me notes with humorous suggestions, like holding a best fence contest or introducing a community bake-off to encourage neighborly cooperation. It struck me as poetic justice. The very person who had tried to sabotage me was now contributing to the harmony of the community. Sitting on my porch one evening, the sun setting behind the rolling hills, I reflected on how far things had come. Cedar Valley Estates was no longer a battlefield of petty power struggles. The HOA functioned smoothly. Residents respected the rules, and I finally felt the quiet satisfaction of authority exercised wisely. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, savoring the warm burn as I gazed over the fields. The horses grazed peacefully, the wind whispered through the trees, and the distant sounds of community life carried across the acreage. The sense of control was intoxicating, but unlike the earlier thrill of confrontation, this was a calm, lasting victory, the kind that comes from understanding, preparation, and the judicious use of power. And yet, I knew that Cedar Valley Estates would always be a living entity, capable of surprise, chaos, and occasional absurdity. That was part of its charm. But now, I had the tools, the knowledge, and the authority to meet whatever came with calm confidence. As night settled over the ranch, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The HOA had tested me, pushed me to my limits, and taught me the art of strategy, diplomacy, and patience. I had emerged not only victorious but respected, admired, and in control of one of the largest properties in the region. Margaret, the board, and even the occasional troublemaking neighbor had learned an important lesson. Cedar Valley Estates was no longer a playground for petty power plays. It was a community guided by clear rules, respect, and the steady hand of someone who understood both the law and human nature. I raised my glass to the horizon, a silent toast of triumph, peace, and the quiet absurdity of being the undisputed ruler of 1,000 acres. Cedar Valley Estates was mine, orderly, secure, and finally, at peace. And for the first time since I moved in, I allowed myself to truly relax. The horses nickered softly, the wind rustled through the trees, and the vast land stretched endlessly before me. It was quiet, it was calm, and it was mine, at least, until the next HOA emergency arose. But that, I thought with a sly smile, would be tomorrow's problem.